Before I introduce the speaker and the talk, though, I'd first of all like to, so Eva, we do this in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon where I'm sitting, but I also acknowledge all of the other Indigenous groups on the lands where I'm sure many of you are also sitting. I'd like for all of us to pay respects to the elders, both past and present, in my case to the Kulin Nation, and also extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians present with us today. So today, this is our second webinar, sorry, in the year, and it's going to be by Professor Eva Schernhammer. Professor Schernhammer is a leader in studies of night work and chronic disease in humans. You can read that, but I can give a little bit of a bio in addition. The list of awards and prizes is extensive. I Googled it and in a way wished I hadn't, but among them, she's in 2015 awarded the Teisner Medal of Honor from the Czech Medical Society in recognition of her major contributions to occupational medicine. Key to this talk today, and some key contributions with which I'm particularly excited and thrilled, is that she's helped demonstrate associations between sleep and shift work with cardiovascular disease, diabetes and mortality. And part of that work has led to one of the original World Health Organization's classifications of shift work as a possible carcinogen in 2007. She's an adjunct professor of epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and a current professor of epidemiology and head of the Department of Epidemiology at the Medical University of Vienna, which is where she's currently not sitting because she's in lockdown. As a Melburnian and a Victorian, I completely empathise with you over this. Today, Eva is going to be presenting a review of some of the scientific evidence related to links between shift work, light at night, and disease risk. And she's going to provide a broad summary of some of the epidemiological studies of circadian disruptions, sleep, and chronic disease. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking, Eva. I'm going to stop sharing because people don't actually want to hear me talk. They would like to hear you talk. I'll stop sharing my screen. And hopefully you should be able to share yours.
Yes, I hope you can see my screen now. Can you?
We can, yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Theresa, and also everybody else who is here today. And hopefully lots of you are from Australia, a country I very much like because Austrians always get mixed up with Australians. How often have I been asked about the kangaroos in Austria? And actually in Austria, people even have t-shirts where it says, I'm not Australian. Anyway, so I like the connection between the countries. I've been there once and it was a wonderful experience, I have to say. And so in my mind, I'm imagining now I am with you there, even though the wonders of the internet allow me to speak to you from Vienna, so far away right now. Well, I want to spend about half an hour talking about much of the research that we have done at Harvard in the last 20 years, and also bringing in other important studies to give an overview of how light, especially light at night, can actually have an adverse impact on human health. And in order to do that, I like to start off by taking you on a time travel. Actually, imagine it's 1877. This is a picture of Boston, my old hometown. And the one thing that I want to point your attention to is the fact that it is really dark and spooky in that picture. Now, this is from Halloween, obviously, but still, it was very dark during those days. And the reason for this is, as probably many of you know, that the electric light had not been introduced into our world yet, because it was only in 1818 that Thomas Edison actually invented the incandescent light bulb. And I'd like to give also kudos to Howard the Timer here, one of the greatest black inventors of all times, who helped Edison improve the filaments of this light bulb. And together, this invention is today what many people believe by and large the most important change that has happened in our world. Well, after Edison basically invented the light bulb, it took a race across the globe. And I am sitting somewhere here in Europe, very close to this town here in Brno, which is why I put it there. Brno is about a 1-hour drive from Vienna, and it is actually the first commercial place where Edison's light bulb was put on show. This is the city theater in that little town there. And in 1882, it was the first public building where artificial light was introduced. Well, and after that, as we all know, it has really taken over everywhere in the world. And it has led to something that has allowed us to basically ignore nights, because we can, with the help of artificial light, make our nights to days. And here you see a picture of Times Square in New York, where actually, if you have ever been there, if you stand there at midnight, you think it's bright daylight, because all the artificial light surrounding you make you believe it couldn't be night. Now, similar pictures obviously have become quite common these days, but they do really point to one bigger issue here, which is that the widespread use of light at night, in particular here in Europe, but the same is true for much of the Western world and other places in the world, has changed the nighttime and has made our nights bright, essentially getting rid of dark nights for most of the parts. And what this does is a couple of things that I want to mention before we dive into human health. Number one, when I grew up, I could see, like you see here on the very right, I could count the stars in the sky. I could see the Milky Way. No longer this is the case in most cities worldwide, because there's so much light pollution occurring nowadays that this is more or less what you see when you look up in the sky if you are in the midst of an urban environment. Now, luckily, many architects are now considering lighting as an important issue. So slowly this is changing, hopefully again. But sadly, this is what has happened over the years. And it has also had a dramatic impact that we changed our lighting at night on flora and fauna. And I'm sure, since you are interested in dark nights, this is not news to you, the negative impacts this light at night can have on animals, for instance. There are multiple examples, many examples, in fact. And I bring here one, which is an abstract that I heard at a conference not too long ago by a German colleague of mine, Stephanie Monneke, who is studying hamsters. And I can relate to hamsters because they were really abundant in Europe, which is where I grew up and where I practiced medicine. And I remember in the hospital where I worked, it was lots of buildings. So if you were walking from one clinic to the other, you had to walk through the gardens, and you would encounter these hamsters quite so often. So they were everywhere, cute little animals. But Stephanie Monneke was pointing out that light pollution, she thinks, could be having contributed to the fact that they are now close to the brink of extinction. And the reason is that these animals, like many other animals, heavily depend on their perception of darkness and day length perceptions, which help them to start their reproductive cycles, for instance. And if this shifts because it's so bright at night that they can no longer discern when the days get shorter, that has really had an impact on the reproductive cycle of these hamsters, so that they now have much smaller litters and essentially have been driven to the brink of extinction. Just one of the many facets that light pollution can have. But now let me shift to humans and how light can affect human health. Now, I'm sure there's a wide range of knowledge here in the audience. Some of you might be quite familiar with how and why light can have an impact on human health, and most importantly, light at night. And others may not. So let me cover a few of these aspects very briefly in some introductory review of the mechanisms that could underlie such an association. The very first studies of basically even considering that light at night could have an adverse impact, were something like this here. Essentially, just putting in numbers where there's bright light, you can see that the cancer mortality rates were seemingly higher compared to where it is darker on this planet. Now, today we know, of course, that these types of studies may or may not have much meaning because they cannot take into account lots of biases, other reasons in these brighter areas that could be linked to higher cancer mortality. Industrialization with all its side effects, chemicals, you name it. So these studies are at best hypotheses rising, and they did give rise to a hypothesis that was essentially stating that light at night could increase a person's cancer risk. And this, of course, required an understanding of however this could be possible. So I'm showing here in a nutshell our current understanding of the mechanisms that occur if a person is exposed to light at night. First of all, it's not any light, although every light at night does have an impact on us. It's importantly mostly the short wavelength, the blue type of light, that most quickly will affect our circadian system. So what is our circadian system? The circadian system is essentially a bunch of neurons in the hypothalamus, or that's what we refer to as the biological clock, which is connected to small clocks in virtually every cell in our body, and we will get to that in a second. But this master pacemaker here in the brain is referred to as the biologic clock often, and anatomically it's called suprachiasmatic nuclei. The suprachiasmatic nuclei are impacted by what the perception of retinal receptors. These are receptors that were only discovered relatively recently, and also about that we will talk a bit more, but they are able to perceive brightness, and if light shines on these receptors at night, it will immediately lead to a suppression of melatonin, which is a biomarker that is secreted at night when it is dark by the pineal gland in the brain. So melatonin is an important hormone, which we will also see a bit more later on, but is often referred to as the hormone of the darkness because of the fact that it is produced almost exclusively at night. So let's come back to the retinal receptor. This receptor in the eye, which is not a rod and not a cone, but a third type of melanopsin-containing receptor, was discovered only in 2003, so not that long ago. And in fact, when I began my work at Harvard Medical School, I remember this was back in 1999, the mechanism here was not discovered yet, so people were wondering, it was pretty clear from lab experiments that light would impact the circadian system. But how exactly, that wasn't clear. And there were experiments conducted actually in the sleep lab of Chuck Seisler back then, where they used flashlights and shown them to the back of your knee, essentially thinking that if this light gets through your skin, somehow it could impact the circadian system. Well, of course, this could not ever be replicated. And a few years later only, it was clear why, because actually the mechanism is a quite different one. And this new retinal receptor was discovered by two independent research groups, one led by Bud Brainard, which probably most of you know. He's located in Pennsylvania, and Kavita Thapan, who works in the Deborah Skeen and Joe Aaron lab in Surrey in the UK. And these two almost simultaneously discovered the retinal receptor that we now know is most receptive to a short wavelength around 460 to 482 nanometers. Well, so there are these circadian rhythms. Circadian comes from the Latin word roughly 24 hours, circadian, and they are affecting almost everything in our body. If you think about the most fundamental rhythms, 24-hour rhythms that we all know of, it's the sleep-wake cycle. But also body temperature follows a pretty distinct 24-hour rhythm with lower temperatures at night when we sleep. The same goes for blood pressure. Drug metabolism follows a 24-hour rhythm. The secretion of many hormones also follows a 24-hour rhythm. Immune system expresses a distinct rhythm when it's most active, and so the list goes on and on. The way light impacts our circadian system through this retinal receptor that I mentioned is, of course, the most important one. But I do want to throw out here now also that there are, in addition, non-photic, so not light-related zeitgebers is what they call them, who can actually impact our biological clock and change or reduce our biological rhythm. These are most importantly the timing of physical activity and the timing of meals, for instance, who can profoundly impact this circadian system. Nonetheless, overall, nothing is as powerful as light in terms of impacting our circadian system. Now, this impact that light has to the retinal receptor and the suprachiasmatic nuclei goes through every organ in our body. It impacts the kidney. Here, for instance, impacts the liver with important effects on metabolism and related diseases. I have already shown now that the circadian clocks or clock genes actually are quite important. Also, they have only been delineated in the last couple of decades. In 2017, if you remember, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded to a group who had been very seminal in discovering these circadian genes and the intricate network that together enables the control of these biological rhythms in our body and every single cell. Well, so we have an impact of light on our circadian system in the brain, and this impacts melatonin secretion. We have briefly talked about that already. But melatonin is an important hormone because of its many and widespread effects it has, which are important for a variety of organs and functions in our body. Melatonin is interesting because, like I said, it's the hormone of the darkness. It's produced almost exclusively at night. Here you see a 24-hour day, and you see that at midnight, around 2, 3 o'clock is when most people have their peak production of melatonin. And you can also see on this slide, which is why I put it up here, that this peak production at night becomes smaller and smaller as we age. And at age 40 or so, the secretion of our melatonin peak at night is already pretty small, but it has its highest peak when children reach age 5 to 10, so before they get into adolescent years, and then starts declining as we get older. Melatonin has oncostatic mechanisms that I also want to mention here because of the connection with cancer that we will see in a minute between light at night and cancer risk. And you can imagine that these important oncostatic mechanisms here can be altered if you change your melatonin secretion. That's actually what was posed under the term Melatonin Hypothesis. The term was coined by Scott Davis and Richard Stevenson, who back in 1987 posed that if you expose a human being to light at night, that will lead to a suppression of their melatonin secretion, which is correct, and that in turn will lead to an increase of their estrogen levels. And in a sense, we already knew that higher estrogen levels can be related to breast cancer risk. So the theory was that suppression of melatonin will lead to a compensatory increase of other hormones, which in turn will increase a woman's breast cancer risk. This is what we refer to as the original melatonin hypothesis, and it was pretty forward-thinking and led many epidemiologists to start thinking about how they could study this type of mechanism or hypothesis. And quickly it became clear that in order to study this, you needed to study a population that has regular and quite dramatic exposure to light at night, which left the look at night workers, because night workers are very relevant as a model population if you want to study these impacts of light at night on health. Number one, they are usually chronically exposed to light at night. So we're not talking about, let's say, I'm flying transatlantic, so I experience some form of jet lag, some form of staying up at night once every couple of months or once every couple of years. That's probably not enough exposure to really change our health risk or our risk of developing chronic diseases. But if I'm chronically exposed to this, then there might be risk associated with it. So that's an important aspect. And also the fact that night workers have their eyes open at night when they work. And, you know, thinking about the retinal receptor, if the eyes are closed and your eyelid is covering your eyes, it will protect the retinal receptor unless you're sleeping in front of really bright light, but it will tend to protect your retinal receptor from receiving too much light input. And last but not least, night workers oftentimes cannot pick and choose their exposure. They work because it's either related to their job or because they, for socioeconomic reasons, have to do night work. So all of this makes night workers a very interesting study population, which then, of course, led to the nurses' health studies as a fabulous population with lots of night workers to start investigating whether they could be useful in studying associations between light at night or night work and chronic disease risk. The nurses' health studies were founded in 1976 by Frank Spicer, and that entailed enrolling 120,000 registered nurses across the United States into a prospective cohort study, which is still ongoing. So now, almost 50 years later, that study is still ongoing. Because of the huge success in 1989, Walter Willett founded the Nurses' Health Study 2, which is another 116,000 women, also all registered nurses who were enrolled into the Nurses' Health Study 2, also followed up to today. And then Sue Hankinson and Graham Colditz established a biobank, which allows now to take these blood samples and urine samples to do all sorts of really meaningful analysis. Like I said, together with the Nurses' Health Study 3, which began in 2010 and has now enrolled over 55,000 participants, this is a resource of almost 300,000 prospectively followed nurses with very interesting patterns of night shift work distribution. So 60% of these nurses have in their life ever worked night shifts, with the remaining 40% never having worked night shifts. These would be nurses who work either in academia or in teaching settings or any outpatient settings without night work. But the remaining 60% have all sorts of length and durations of night shift work history, as you can see here. Well, in 2001, we published our first paper using this prospective cohort, and it was given a lot of attention because it was the first prospective cohort study where we were able to take into account a lot of confounding factors and all sorts of things that usually would leave previous studies, the few that there were, leave them to doubt that perhaps other reasons could explain what was seen there. So this was, I would say, the first really thoroughly done and prospectively followed study on night work and breast cancer risk, and did show that women after many years of night shift work did have a significantly elevated risk of developing breast cancer, but not only breast cancer. This was also found for colorectal cancer, for cervical cancer, for lung cancer, more recently hematopoietic cancers. So many of the oncogenic endpoints we studied were actually elevated in these night workers. Back then, this is from 2005, and I'm pointing to that time because in 2007, the first evaluation of the International Agency of Cancer Research took place to study night work and see whether it's a cancer risk factor. Back then, there was evidence base of about 10, 15 studies, by and large, suggesting a 50% increased risk of breast cancer. And back then, the first 2 studies in men had been published, because the nurses' health studies, for instance, are only women. And in any event, breast cancer was the primary endpoint studied up to then. But the attention shifted to men, and it became clear, even in these initial studies, one conducted in Japan and one in Canada, that also men might potentially have a higher risk of cancer, in this case prostate cancer, if they work night shifts. This study here, the Japanese one, adjusted, among other things, for perceived job stress, which is not commonly done because it's not often collected as an information on each study participant, but they were able to adjust for it and still found a 3-fold increased risk of prostate cancer among shift workers. And the Canadian study suggested that especially men who began shift work in their earlier years, in their mid-20s, had a higher risk compared to the other men working night shifts. Back then, we also began to develop melatonin as a biomarker for use in large-scale prospective cohort studies, saying that we wanted to have first morning urines to capture the peak melatonin production of the night before. And so we validated this by, for instance, comparing urine samples that were collected 3 years apart, every year 1 urine sample, with hoping that these markers would remain fairly consistent over time, so that we could use them as a sort of chronic exposure marker for cancer risk. And the intra-class correlation, so the correlation between these 3-year measures, was pretty high, comparable to what you would see, for instance, for cholesterol, when you would compare these measures over 3 years. We used this biomarker then also in the nurses' health study cohort, where morning urine samples had been collected at some time point to check whether indeed, as one would suspect, the women with lower melatonin levels would have a higher breast cancer risk. And this is what we found, that indeed those with the higher melatonin secretion were more protected, and by contrast, those with lower melatonin would then have a higher risk. And all of this evidence base existed back in 2007 when, as I said, WHO or the IARC convened a working group and determined that shift work that involves circadian disruption, so most likely involves night work, is probably carcinogenic to humans. Denmark back then even went ahead to start compensating women who developed breast cancer on their job if they had worked for at least 20 years night shifts. Since 2010, then, lots of new studies have been published. And I don't know how many of you know that in 2019, a re-evaluation of this assessment from 2007 took place with all the new studies that had been published up to then. And I just want to highlight, first of all, the vast number of new studies. Now we have over 60 studies that have examined the association between night work and a variety of cancers, including breast cancer. In fact, most of them still focusing on breast cancer, but now also looking at non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, melanoma, thyroid cancer, etc. And most of these studies still do suggest that the longer duration of night work is associated with these cancers. The same goes for men. Now there are way over 20 studies that have looked at the association between night work and cancers in men. Most of the times prostate cancer, but also cancer of the digestive system and of the lung. And also suggesting that night work in men is associated with a higher risk of cancer. In fact, for instance, for prostate cancer, the vast evidence base that had accrued over the years suggests in combined fashion that there's a significantly increased risk. Now, 2 more studies from the Nurses' Health Study were published in the last couple of years that I want to show you real quick. One of them is a follow-up on the initial studies that came from 2001. But now with 24 years of follow-up and a total of, in the first Nurses' Health Study, almost 6,000 breast cancer cases, and in the second Nurses' Health Study, 3,570 breast cancer cases. And the bottom line of these studies is that if you follow women who have already reached close to retirement age, which was the case in the Nurses' Health Study, follow them for 24 years, you end up following them a lot into their retirement years. And you see that the risk that was higher while they were working night shifts goes down back to baseline eventually over the years if they stop working night shifts. And by contrast, in the Nurses' Health Study 2, where you have women at baseline at the beginning of the analysis that were in the midst of their working career, if you follow them for 24 years, essentially 24 years of night work, you see that they have a significantly higher risk of breast cancer. The second study, real quick, and I'm sure it interests you, is you're looking at light at night, actually. Also in the Nurses' Health Study, every single dot here represents a woman that participates in the Nurses' Health Study. And there is a system that allows to derive the actual light exposure down to the 1 square kilometer scale related to the residential address of each of these nurses. And it was possible with this system to assign light values to each of the women. And what we found is that among the women with the highest light exposure, so in the top 20% light exposure at night surrounding their residential address, there was a significantly higher risk of breast cancer in the study. So together, the 2 studies suggested that especially among the younger women, and especially for ER-positive breast tumors, that both night work and light at night would have an impact on their breast cancer risk. Now here's a picture from the assessment in 2019 that I mentioned, the reassessment of light at night. And the outcome of this assessment was that most value was placed on 2 studies that were considered of highest quality. One of them, we already looked at, the Nurses' Health Study, with the 24 years of follow-up and the interesting difference between following women into retirement versus truly through their work career. And the second study that was considered really informative was a pooled case control study by Cordina Diverger, where various exposure metrics were used, for instance, intensity of night work or number of night hours per week. And all of these metrics suggested that, especially among the younger women, that there was a significantly higher risk of breast cancer related to them. And so the totality of the evidence continues to support carcinogenic effects of night shift work. And this is also how the IARC re-evaluated it. Now, Erhard Haus, and now I want to go real quick through the other findings that have emerged over the last couple of decades. He already pointed out way back that the whole shift work problem is very important, he said, but cancer is just one aspect. And so in the meantime, we have examined all sorts of other diseases and wanted to understand whether they were related to night work. And in fact, let me quickly guide you through this. Higher melatonin levels are protective of developing hypertension in this particular study here. You see the women with the highest melatonin have the lowest risk of becoming hypertensive, and likewise night workers, especially if they are Black, have a significantly higher risk of developing hypertension. So the 2 again complement each other and suggest a relation of light at night in developing hypertension. Also for cardiovascular disease risk, the longer a person works night shifts, the higher the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. But once a person stops working night shifts, there seems to be potential that the risk comes back down again to what it was after a number of years having not worked night shifts. We looked at diabetes risk, again, checking, for instance, whether higher melatonin levels would be protective or lower melatonin levels would increase diabetes risk. And indeed, that is what we found, a significantly more than twofold increased risk of diabetes. And also, not only for melatonin, but among night workers, we found that longer years of night work increased the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And for the first time, we saw here an interesting interaction between chronotypes, meaning that early morning types tend to do worse if they work night shifts compared to evening types, who are more in line, it seems, with working hours that also occur at night. Now, chronotypes are distributed across the population so that most people fall into this medium spectrum, basically being neither nor morning or evening types. But there are a number of people, about 15%, who are very late types, and then there are about 20% who are early morning types. And it became pretty obvious that these morning chronotypes fare better if they work 3 days day shift. Here you see them in blue and in red, the morning and intermediate types having a much nicer circadian rhythm than the evening types. If the evening types have to work day shifts, they don't seem to do so well. Here on the right side, you see them 3 days doing night shifts in a row. And you can see that the evening types are doing better here because the evening night work aligns better with the chronotype, is what we think, compared to the morning and intermediate types. So it led us to think that perhaps it's not everybody equally affected by light at night, but that there could be something like a mismatch between internal and external clock, which has been examined by a few now, for instance, looking at cancer risk. And I just want to show you how this is done then. Johnny Hansen published a study on night shift work and breast cancer, and he stratified by morning types and evening types. And you can see, as you would expect, that the morning types breast cancer risk is 4 times higher, versus the risk for the evening types is only 2 times higher. So here you see an indication of chronotype mattering. There's another example of a Spanish case control study looking at prostate cancer risk, where again, especially for the evening types, the risk was not as high as for the morning types. As you can see here, morning type risk is 1.79, evening types risk is 1.33. And more recently, a study that we did across generations, now studying if a woman worked night shifts during pregnancy, whether this would impact the depression risk of their offspring. And even here we see that chronotype seems to matter. Morning types fare worse, have a higher risk of having an offspring with depression than the intermediate or evening types. And then, of course, there's more interesting stuff that needs to be done with the clock genes that are probably quite predictive of an individual's tolerance towards shift work, as are many other factors that we are currently studying. And I will get to an end here to let you room for some questions. Basically, just want to say, does this mean we now have to reduce all light at night? I think no. I think we have more work to do to delineate who exactly we can best serve by which type of intervention or advice. And so there's this work that we're doing to really work towards precision prevention. And then, of course, the architectural lighting, which will be relevant to you, and we can discuss now, if you like, with the really more tailored approach towards developing lighting designs for light at night that is helpful not only for humans, but also for flora and fauna. I do need to acknowledge the funding that has enabled all this research, all of it NIH funds, including infrastructure for the nurses' health study cohorts. And a big thank you to many of the young people who helped do this work. There's Celine Vetter, for instance, Lani Wegersin, Jen Massa, Eric Su, Claudia Fitzgerald, and Elizabeth DeWar. And so I will stop here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eva. I've got so many questions. We've got a few in the chat. Note, I can also open people if you, maybe I'll just read these two out. If anyone would like to ask a question themselves, then I can actually open you up to answer yourself. But we have one from Landon. Hang on, let me just make that larger. If melatonin secretion naturally decreases with age, do you increase or decrease your susceptibility to circadian disruption as you get older?
It is a good question. Well, I would like to start off saying that while I do always say that it declines with age, melatonin production, it's based on cross-sectional studies. And I can see that perhaps this might turn out differently if we had longitudinal studies. And the reason I'm saying this is I'm thinking about the centenarian study from Japan, where individuals 100 or older were studied, and they had quite robust circadian rhythms. Now, of course, more studies would be needed to look at this. There is not a single longitudinal study where you measure melatonin over time to really show that in that individual it declines with age. I could also see an argument that your melatonin levels decline because you become frail. But if you're able to stay healthy as you get older, perhaps your melatonin levels don't decline as much. So this type of study would be needed. But let's assume melatonin levels decline. I think you would become, in some sense, more unstable. We see that in your sleeping patterns. They become less strong as we get older, in part attributed to the lower melatonin. So probably circadian disruption will impact you more. Whether it also impacts your health equally strongly remains to be studied. That I'm not sure of, but for sure, I think people would be more susceptible to circadian disruption.
That kind of answers all I got. I've got what I'll do a couple from the chat first, and then I'll do one of the Q&A ones. So Marnie's asked, and this is a really interesting one: has there been any study done on astronomers? Because they typically do shift work, but they're not so exposed to light at night. So they might almost be a control group.
Well, I have an interesting comparison to you. There was a study once conducted. This was at the time when people looked at blind individuals and were thinking, if you're blind, you cannot perceive darkness, cannot perceive light at night, which it turned out was not correct, because back then it wasn't known that there's a third receptor, which is actually functioning in most blind individuals. So those studies, whatever they showed, I think we have to look at differently now. But in those days, a study was conducted among Kodak photo developers who also work in the dark chamber for most of the time. And these studies did suggest, small and not very well conducted, obviously, that they have a lower risk of breast cancer, I believe, is what they studied. So yeah, there could be something to it, but we don't really have good studies to support it. Theoretically, I would agree.
Great. I've got a few more. Does taking melatonin at night help solve the blue light issue? So can you compensate? It's one of the things we do in our lab. We feed our animals melatonin to see if we can recover, but would that work in a human model system?
Well, you wouldn't probably take it while you're at night shifts, because what you really would need to do is to shift your circadian system. If you're exposed to light at night, you would want to, like as if you're flying across time zones, you get used to the new time zone after a few days. So our body is in theory adaptable. It can adjust. So if, let's say, you would do 7 days of night work and always sleep during the day, you would start producing your melatonin at different times, and you can adjust to it. But the problem, and that's why for the most part we look at rotating night shift workers, although most night work involves a change between day and night sleep, because it's a constant disruption of your body trying to get used to a new circadian rhythm. So in some sense, you would have to take melatonin probably in the morning to give yourself a sleep stimulus. But this hasn't been really tested, and it's also in part because melatonin has never been studied in healthy individuals as a preventive for more than 6 months, and there's a bit of a concern about the long-term effects on the reproductive system, for instance, in young individuals, if you do take it for no good reason in a healthy individual for many years, let's say.
I can comment on that. So I do this in animals. we actually fed lots of different concentrations to animals, and at high concentrations we had to stop the trials because it was detrimental to health. So, anyway. This is a follow-on question, I think, which follows on nicely from that one. Can an individual switch from being one chronotype to another chronotype over their lifetime? So can you go from being a morning type to an evening type? And what events?
Yeah, I mean, there are two concepts of chronotype. It's a discussion also among us scientists. I personally look at the assessment of the Horney-Osterberg questionnaire for chronotype, which looks at it as a trait. And in that sense, I think it's a given trait that you probably inherit, or because you grow up in an environment that makes, but I think there's a lot of genetics underlying. That trait does not change. So whether I'm naturally gravitating towards liking to be up in the evening doesn't change, and it only becomes slightly earlier for everyone as we get older, but in parallel. So an evening type becomes slightly less evening, but a morning type becomes even more morning. So everybody shifts towards morning. But you can, of course, adjust. This doesn't change your trait, in my view. It's what Till Rönneberg, for instance, refers to as social jet lag. Everybody who is a young mother and has a child at home knows that the chronotype, of course, will change, but it's not a permanent change, in my view, because your underlying trait will always be there, and if it's given opportunity, probably will shift again to what is more natural, your sleep time. But yes, there's these two concepts of what is your current chronotype based on your living circumstances and what is your trait, in my view.
I was going to say being a mother definitely shifted my chronotype. So we need night workers in our society. Do you think there could be a way, so this is from Natalie Farrell, do you think there could be a way we could biologically engineer something to allow melatonin to be produced even while being exposed to artificial light at night? Could we make it mandatory that they take melatonin supplements? And I mean, you've already kind of talked about this, are they efficient in replacing natural levels of melatonin?
Well, yes, I mean, there's lots of thought has been going into what can you really end up doing for night shift workers, right? I'm not sure mandatory melatonin. I'm not sure I would suggest that, but for sure, number one is, the truth is most of us don't live perfectly healthy. So there's so many other things usually you can work on that are perhaps more easy. Like you can make sure you don't gain weight. You can make sure you exercise. You can make sure you do all the things that are good for you. If on top of that, you want to alleviate the burden of night work, solutions could be, we do see that duration matters. So perhaps there's a 5-year or whatever cap that any given person should work night shifts, because otherwise it starts impacting their health. Perhaps night shift work should be done in a staggered fashion, because the impact on the metabolic system, for instance, and this weight gain that we see because we have to eat at the wrong time of the day, etc., that's probably hard to overcome without major effort. So maybe the body should be given reprieve every now and so often in between to recover from the strain of night work. And then we are working towards more tailored approaches, because I really do think, and we see it in our data, that not everybody is impacted the same way, which is why lighting solutions are probably not optimal, because they may be good for one person, but not for the other. So anything that's like one case that has to fit everybody is, I don't think, the best solution. And for some, melatonin may end up being the best solution, but it's most likely not for everyone.
I'm going to take the liberty of asking one of my own questions, actually. So the question I've got is that we know there's quite a lot of melatonin in the gut. And I'm just wondering how much work, and we often work on circulating levels of melatonin rather than gut melatonin. I'm just wondering how much impact that has in driving some of the effects that we're seeing with its interactions with other hormones related to hunger, for example.
Well, it's a very good point. And I don't think, as you say, that much research has been done on it, but I agree. So I cannot say much about it. Maybe somebody else has more work done on it. And I also haven't paid too much attention lately to it, but I agree. You're having an interesting point here. Yeah, so this probably is something that would be interesting to study a little more. Just like, for instance, so there's so many ideas out there that would be cool to follow up on. I was just thinking about cataracts, and when your lenses get cloudy, how that may impact, including the new lens that gets implanted, your vision and your circadian system. And I know that, for instance, there are trials on the way to look at that, which I think will be interesting. And for the guts, yeah, I agree. It would be interesting to see what role this melatonin in the gut plays, and in which capacity it would be important compared to the circulating one.
Thank you for everyone for that, Liberty. So Maddie Nam, so this is one of my master's students actually. Are the results from melatonin studies being used to help develop methods for detecting cancer earlier? So cancer risk, I guess.
I'm not exactly sure from the melatonin studies, meaning from the biomarker studies, probably, right? For early, so I can only imagine now what Maggie means. It's probably that, can I screen, and if somebody has lower melatonin levels, does this tell me they have a higher risk of cancer, for instance? This has not been easy because we don't have established normal values for melatonin. In fact, there's a lot of variation between individuals. Some people produce naturally very little, others produce very much, and we don't have a good understanding of that difference. It's definitely there, and I think that would make it hard to basically say, oh, at this level you're probably at higher risk. What we do know is that if you suppress your nightly melatonin production, then that's why we see a risk going up after a couple of times or years you have done this. But with the actual levels per se, it would be more difficult.
There's just two more questions, so I'm going to do two more and then we'll allow Eva off the hook. It's early morning for her at the moment. So how do you work out which type you are in terms of your chronotype? I'm assuming you just don't put an alarm on, but
it's very easy, actually. You can do tests. They can be found online. Like I said, there's this trait one, which you can do by doing the Horne-Ostberg questionnaire, morningness, eveningness scale. It's 19 questions and you can sum up the score. But in fact, the 19th question is, do you consider yourself to be more of a morning type, definite morning type, more of an evening type, definite evening type, or none of them? And that simple question has been validated to some degree to correspond with the overall score. So if you ask yourself that question, you probably have already a very good answer. But you can do the entire questionnaire and calculate your score. And for the social jet lag, there's the Munich questionnaire, which you can also find online, I think, which basically asks you, when do you typically go to bed? When do you typically go up? So there's a set of questions that allows you then to also arrive at an estimate of your chronotype, but they should be very comparable by and large.
All right, final question. As a means of mitigating some of these issues, would blue light glasses help reduce the stimulation of the third type of receptor, so the non-visual photoreceptors?
Blue light glasses, well, it would have been orange glasses I would have thought of to filter out the blue wavelengths, and these types of things have been, I think even in rats they have used orange glasses. I think I read that somewhere, to see whether this changes their perception of light and in turn the impact on the circadian system. I personally think it's impractical, and most of the times, because if you are working at night, you tend to have to see well, and if you wear orange red goggles, your vision will be less good. But I do think that something else will be useful for night workers, which is a good light stimulus in the morning on their regular days. So I always say, if you have a dog and you have to walk that dog in the morning, that's actually exactly optimal, because you will get your light stimulus if you go outside. And I think that will help your circadian system to be strong. And so go out into the nature and make sure you get enough sunlight, or daylight for that matter, especially in the morning.
think we do sometimes forget that actually it's the day-night rhythm that's really important, and a lot of us sit in an office all day with lights that are way too dim.
Exactly.
That's also a big problem. All right, I'm going to cut questions here. I think we've got through most of them, so thank you very much for those that have attended. A huge thanks to you, Ava, for a fantastic talk. I've got so many questions. I may actually email you afterwards.
Yes.
So to everyone else, I'm just going to very quickly share my screen again. If you'd like to help give Ava a round of applause, you can do it by raising your hands or just clapping. I'll do it for you.
Well, thank you all for having me. It was my real pleasure.
No,